right, so welcome everybody to Reducing Customer Acquisition Costs. I'm going to be working this with both Hayes and Andrew. All right, so the Gradient Works RevOps Co-op. As a little bit of housekeeping in the beginning, if you have any questions, please make sure you jump ahead and throw your question in the Q&A section so we can keep track of them and address them as they come in. With that being said, the chat is always open. Please, we'd love to hear your feedback, love to hear any responses you have, any of the topics, and keep that going. I will be in there, respond to everybody and addressing any questions as well, and making sure that we bring them up and respond to them accordingly. But without further ado, let's get this kicked off and go ahead and introduce some of our great panelists we have today. We both have Hayes and Andrew. Hayes, you want to go kick it off and introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Great to be here, everybody. I'm Hayes. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Gradient Works. What we do at Gradient Works is we have a platform that helps sales teams adopt a new type of account coverage model, a new type of territory model called dynamic books. And it's really all about driving rep efficiency. So one of the things that we try to do for all of our customers is help them improve their sales organization so that they can reduce CAC and CAC payback, which we'll talk about here. Yeah, this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Previous roles prior to starting Gradient Works was I was SVP of RevOps at a large publicly traded company, and we had a lot of challenges around driving efficiency. We were very EBITDA-driven type organization, which I think has been a good proving ground for the current economic environment. So excited to talk about how to drive efficiency.
Awesome. Thank you, Hayes. And Andrew, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Andrew DeJofoy. I'm the SVP of Revenue Platform at Quantive, formerly known as GTM Hub. We rebranded a few months ago, but Revenue Platform is a sort of a umbrella term for everything RevOps, Rev Enablement, recruiting, training. Anybody that isn't working directly on a deal basically reports into me, and our goal is really to fine-tune the revenue engine and increase productivity, increase rep attainment, as well as things like decreasing our CAC and basically decreasing CAC payback and things like that. So this is a subject that's very near and dear to my heart. My background is primarily in pre-sales solution consulting, and I've built and led pre-sales engineering teams at multiple startups, notably Sprinkler and Markforged. But my background originally, I started out as a journalist and then got into PR and digital marketing advertising. So been kind of all over the map.
Awesome. Well, that's a wild change start. Well, it sounds like we're gonna have a great topic discussion here. A lot of background and a lot of relevance for the community here as well. So please, everybody's chance to pick their brain while we're here and then continue this in the community. So I'm gonna go ahead and kick it over to Hayes to get this started.
All right, excited to talk about this today, and I'm super excited that we can have Drew with us as a customer who's dealing with a lot of these types of challenges. So look, I gotta say, I'm amazed at how many people registered for a webinar with the title "This Boring." But we're going to talk a lot about customer acquisition costs. We're going to talk about CAC, but specifically, we're going to talk about CAC payback, which I may have made it sound even more boring. We'll see. But I want to dive into why this matters so much right now for all of you in RevOps, and I think it's probably best to do that with a simple chart. 2023 is a tough environment for a lot of us. I'm going to assume that many of you, if you're in this, in this webinar, you're probably in B2B sales. You're probably you probably have a lot of exposure in your customers and your own company to tech. And so what we've seen is that there's a lot of layoffs out there. There's a lot of challenges and a lot of headwinds. And we've gone from a model in the past couple of years that was, capital was free. Investment is just around the corner. As much money as you need. Let's grow, grow, grow. And that model is pretty much dead now. Now what you're hearing from investors, what you're hearing from really anybody who's trying to build a business right now is that that growth at all costs model that we've been living in for so long is dead. Many of us may not have even experienced a whole lot of time in our career, if you're relatively early in your career, you've really only experienced the growth at all costs kind of mentality. And so now we've really got to think about efficiency. And efficiency is this is a bunch of ops folks here, so maybe efficiency is a little bit of a sexier term for ops folks than it is for most people, but that's really what we have to think about. And I want to make sure that, in my previous role running RevOps, at a large company, one of the challenges with RevOps a lot of times is you get kind of myopically focused on, your particular areas and the particular fires that you're dealing with and things like that. And you don't always think about really up leveling to what are the things that the board is talking about? What are the things that the senior most leadership in the company is talking about and thinking about? And the thing I love when I'm talking about CAC payback is this is a boardroom conversation. So if you're thinking about how you as a RevOps person are going to drive value in your organization and get the attention of senior leadership and really ensure that you're moving the needle, this is something to really deeply understand. And this is why I care about it so much. And the reason it matters is because, and it's a mouthful, gross margin adjusted CAC payback. And I'm going to go through each one of these pieces. But the reason it matters is this. Essentially, what this tells you is how quickly and efficiently your go-to-market engine is converting all of the costs that go into acquiring a customer into revenue and ultimately cash that you can reinvest in acquiring the next customer. You reduce this payback period, you reduce CAC. When you do that, you can acquire the next customer faster and faster and faster. And so it is the key to unlocking growth, which is why we care about this, mouthful of keywords here. So let me break it down. So we'll start with CAC, customer acquisition cost. And now the title of this webinar is reducing CAC, but it's not as simple as just reducing CAC, because if you sell $100,000 product, you can spend a lot to acquire that customer. If you sell $1,000 product, you can't spend as much to acquire that customer. But at the end of the day, the thing to know about CAC is it's all your sales and marketing expenses that go into acquiring new revenue. And some folks talk about CAC in two different ways. One way is to talk about it in terms of acquiring a customer. So it's kind of the denominator, or the way people talk about it might be we spend X to get a customer. Another way to look at it is we spend X to get $1, right? And I tend to want to lean into, and most people I think lean into, the dollar type approach to this, because ultimately that normalizes everything, right? You get a big customer, you get a small customer. It's really how much are we spending to go get $1. So that's customer acquisition cost. So key component here. Now, payback is also fairly simple on its own. It's the number of months it takes to get the money back that you spent to acquire a customer, right? So it's fairly simple in that regard. Let's say that you charge customers $100 a month and it costs you $1,200 to acquire a customer. It's a 12-month payback period, right? Now, the key is you got to not cheat. You got to make sure that you're including all of your costs that are, in P&L terms. Like if you're looking at the books, it's going to be COGS, cost of goods sold. It's effectively all the money that you're spending to support and keep a customer happy and functional, right? It's all the hosting costs for your product. It's all the everything that goes into making sure the product works. It's all the support costs, right? And so it's really important. And I wrote a LinkedIn post about gross margin adjusted CAC payback a while ago. And there was a pretty prominent VC who popped up and it's like, well, all CAC payback should be gross margin adjusted. And he's absolutely right. But I feel like it's always important to include that in here, so everybody knows that you can't just look at how much revenue you get. You've got to adjust it for your gross margin. So I promise we'll be done with the math lecture here in just a second, and we'll get into ways you can actually impact this number. But let me break it down for you. And this is, if you go look, I've got some resources at the end of this, but OpenView has a great post about this metric, and this is kind of how they define it, but the basic idea is the same everywhere. Everything that goes in your sales and marketing expenses, all your headcount, the tech stack, digital ads, whatever it is that goes into that, you include that in the numerator. You need to have a particular period. It could be a year, it could be a quarter. You want to measure it over a period of time, though. That's key to this, and probably not, just a month is enough. You want to look at it over a longer period of time. Then you take the amount of ARR, MRR, however you look at that you acquired in that period, both from new business and from expansions. And then you essentially multiply it by your gross margin. Now your gross margin is going to look like something like 85% or something like that. And so that's going to discount the new revenue that you acquired. And you're doing that because it represents the costs that you've got. So, all right, math time is mostly over. Now we're going to go to spreadsheet time. So it's basically still math time. But this is a really good way that that a lot of folks use to look at their CAC payback. I've seen it called the layer cake. And I guess that's just to make it sound more accessible and, again, less boring. But think about it this way. The math is relatively straightforward here. You know, take your new business, upsell revenue, put all that together, add in your gross margin to discount it, right? And then go look at all your major expenses for sales and marketing, right? Your people, headcount, you can see headcount's a big piece across all of this, your performance advertising, tech stack, all of those types of things. And then the layer cake is really all about taking each one of those components individually and figuring out what contribution it makes to your total payback period, right? So long story short, when you look at this organization right here, they have a 26-month payback. So what that means is when they acquire a customer, that customer damn well better stick around for 3 years or so. They have to have that customer on for more than 2 years before they really start making money and making that back, right? So this is a contrived example, but that's a way of how you can look at this. And then you can look at this layer cake and start to realize, oh, wow, the biggest contribution is sales headcount and marketing headcount, right? So that brings us to the part where I'm actually going to ask Drew to talk now. But one of the things that a lot of folks really want to think about in a RevOps context is, okay, we're in an efficiency world now. We're in a world where we can't just grow, we can't just throw money at everything. We actually have to think about how we do that. So a lot of what you're seeing right now, including those layoffs, various headcount reductions and things like that, those are the results of folks trying to fix this CAC payback that's broken in their organization. So we've identified a few plays here that you see people run and that you can run yourself. Like, first of all, the one we never want to do is, yeah, you can cut people, right? Another one is, and I think, Drew, when I was talking to him about this, kind of referred to it as like, look for your ratios of, one headcount to another, and then start to figure out if you can make that more efficient and reduce those. So I'll toss it over to Drew to talk about that particular play, because I think it's really important for a lot of folks.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point. A lot of people initially look at, the most common ratio that people think about, I think, when it comes to sales is SDR to AE, for example. But they're also span of control, right? Looking at your manager ratios and how many AEs can a manager support, for example, as well as things like solution consultants or pre-sales, right? That's a lot of my world in the past. And we used to always go for a rule of thumb of about 2.5 or 3 to 1 solution consultants for, upper end of mid-market or enterprise. But you can look at ways of trying to make them more efficient to be able to maybe get by with a little bit of a leaner ratio, because each time any of those ratios, every time you add one new rep, for example, you might have to add in maybe incremental hires to support them, right? Or if you're going to spin up a new team, each one of those ratios and those assumptions you make can have a big impact and eat away at your budget. Also, I'm in the variable comp world right now of doing all of our comp plans. And that's one of the things I think about too, is that the way that comp plans work, if people are all tied to quotas and tied to, a number like that, the more people you have that are tied to a smaller number of reps producing actual numbers on the board or retiring quota, means you're giving away a larger slice of the pie for every dollar you bring in too.
Yeah. And I think, this is if you make this play, if you decide to run this play, it looks really good on paper. And I think generally speaking, I think we have as a, as an industry gotten a little sloppy about this. Like the SDR to AE ratios have kind of crept up, and there's less desire to have AEs prospect and things like this. But you also need to remember that if you're asking a group of AEs who have never really been full cycle AEs to go prospect and run sales cycles at the same time, and you've never really asked them to do that before, then you better have a really, really good way to keep them focused on high quality accounts, to keep them enabled to do that, and remove, and we'll talk about focus a lot in a minute, but remove all of the distractions they might experience, or else you might see your pipeline ultimately just tank, even though it looks like you're going to save a lot of money.
Yeah. One thing I would also say about this one too, when you're looking at the ratios, we no longer have the luxury of going off of rule of thumb ratios, or maybe that ratio that you use at your last company that you can just skate by and say, oh yeah, it's 5-to-1, right? We actually just went through this exercise looking at our BDR team, where we essentially worked backwards and did the reverse funnel math to figure out how many closed $1 of ARR, or how much pipeline do they need to drive to actually even just pay for themselves, right? What does a break-even point look like? And the number kind of surprised us a little bit, and it gave us a very different target number than I think we initially thought about. And then you have to gut check that against data and see what's attainable. But I think it's incumbent on all of us as good stewards of what those ratios are and how we build out our models to question those assumptions every time we build a new model, as opposed to just relying on the old steady rule of thumb.
Hey, so Hayes and Andrew, we had a question come in just based around kind of sales headcount from somebody that in the group. They asked if they should be including severance pay, as it may have been a recent addition to the expense list that they have for the company.
Yeah, I mean, what you want to try to do with CAC, and Drew may have a slightly different answer to this, but I mean, you're trying to find your productivity at a steady state, if you think about CAC payback, right? So things that represent these types of hopefully one-time issues, right, are things that you don't necessarily want to include in that. So if you have essentially, restructuring costs, if you will, for the team, I wouldn't necessarily include that. Drew, does that sound right to you?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I also think this goes to the time period that you look at. This is slightly related in the sense that if you're looking at a long enough time period for your business, that would get smoothed out over time. But you also have to choose the right time period when you're looking at CAC and CAC payback to make sure that it's appropriate for your sales cycles. So if you're looking at a much shorter time period, that's going to have a bigger impact. So that's something to consider taking out. But I would agree with that.
Yeah. So think about some of the other plays. We talked about how you can tweak, or I shouldn't use the term tweak to make it sound simple. It's not simple. Laying off people is never simple, but restructuring your team is never simple. So that's a hard thing to go do. So a lot of people, what they do is they also want to think about how do we target different segments and kind of double down maybe on what's been working, right? And so one of the most common things that I see, and I kind of like thematically put these next 3 bullet points together, is to say, like, your CRO presents at the board meeting and says, look, here's how we're going to make our number. We've had to cut headcount. Our quota capacity is lower, but we're going to make our number by going up market, or focusing on a particular vertical where we've had success before, or we're going to focus on expansion with existing customers, or we're going to lean into our PLG motion, whatever that might be. And it's really all about saying, we're going to lean into some type of account segment or part of our ICP that we think we can be more successful in and more efficient in. And hopefully, and you all probably been part of that, if they're signing up for that, there's data behind why you would do that. But what I will say is that, avoid, as you're thinking about these, be careful of the risks. And some of the risks that I'll point out here are, it's really easy to look at going up market as a panacea, right? So, oh, look, I have the same quota capacity, basically the same number of reps. I'll just up their quota a bit, and suddenly, like, magically, I've got more quota capacity. And then I'm going to, and then we're going to sell, bigger deals, right? Boom, like we've solved the CAC payback problem because now our deals are 50K instead of 25K or whatever the case may be, right? The reality is, and I know Drew's got some comments on that, like going up market, especially if that's not been your motion, is not as easy as you might hope, all right? And so, Drew, you were saying some of the things about like just the grunt work that's required from the rest of the organization.
Yeah. I think people too often discount the true cost of going up market. There are a lot of hidden costs. And, if you're looking at, okay, maybe it's you're looking at, okay, I can double my deal size, right? But if your costs scale just as much, you haven't really accomplished much of anything, right? And if anything, you're likely to underestimate the amount of how much those costs are going to scale. One example, I've worked at companies that have looked at going up market, and they don't factor in, especially in SaaS, a lot of the costs around product and engineering that go into it, right? There are a lot of things around security, SSO, SAML, as well as accessibility, right? There are certain customers of ours that we've had to build accessibility features for, or they just won't do business with us, or even certain markets that have requirements of vendors to be able to sell software, whether that's a different country or region like the EU. So based off of that, you could make a decision on the revenue side to go up market or go into a new market entirely and not realize that you're actually signing up the rest of your organization for a considerable lift on their side in terms of resources. And if you're only looking at sales and marketing expense, that won't show up in CAC. But if you're looking at gross margin adjusted, then it will, right?
Yeah. So, where people are really leaning right now is, I think, and probably one of the better places to lean, if you can, is on your existing customers. If you've got a clear path where you can go engage your customers, whether those are customers, that you've sold through a sales motion or a sales-led motion, or whether it's a PLG motion, if you can go to those folks and find, inexpensive expansion opportunities, then by all means, go do that. You're removing a ton of CAC in that case. You're not having to acquire the customer brand new. It's not free. You're spending time on it, right? And there's headcount that's devoted to it, right? But the marketing spend, those types of things aren't necessarily there. And if, in theory, your win rates would be higher if you can do that. So it's a really good play to go do. I think it's important. And I know some of the questions that we got from Dylan ahead of time were related to like sales assisted PLG motions. I know Drew has some things to say on that, but I think there's always, there's something I see, and we've seen this from some of our customers, where you have a PLG motion and you have maybe like a large self-service customer base. And there may or may not be kind of a natural mechanism for when you can engage and expand. In some cases, effectively trying to engage them with sales may be almost like a brand new, like cold sales cycle, if they really don't have a lot of engagement with your company otherwise. So try to really understand when you're doing a sales assisted motion on your PLG, opportunity or leads or your PLG accounts. Are you effectively getting a brand new sales cycle where you have to convince them that there's an opportunity with your organization and you've maybe just like done a little bit warmer sales cycle, or are you actually just kind of greasing the wheels for an expansion? And so, Drew, I know that's something that you all have worked with.
Yeah, so we actually have implemented, we call it an SSQL, or self-serve qualified lead. Our roots as a company at Quantive, we are an OKR software company. We were one of the earlier ones in the space, and we were primarily PLG. It's only been in the last couple of years, actually, that we've leaned more heavily into a sales-led motion. But now we're using that as almost a flywheel to help drive revenue and expansion. And even if we're seeing smaller deals, the level of effort that it takes to win those and the cycle times are way lower. And our conversion rate is probably 10 to 20x on a self-serve qualified lead than on an MQL, if not much higher. So, but you have to figure out, to Hayes' point, how do you separate the wheat from the chaff in that regard? And one of the things we're just doing is, based on our pricing model, we are looking at essentially the potential of the account in terms of, in our case, the size of the account, and then having different routing rules based off of that, right? So I don't want an enterprise AE chasing after a $5,000 expansion of a self-serve customer, but a BDR who's really hungry about moving into an AE role and wanting that experience of running a full sales cycle end to end. That's a great opportunity to get them to flex beyond their role. And then you also have the side benefit of creating a pathway for BDRs for advancement into AE roles and closer roles, right? Which then is also accretive because it reduces your acquisition costs for new hires, right? So.
And I want to kind of tie the last bullet here with the red flags to what we're going to talk about in the next slide as well. So these are some plays that you can make, but I want to talk a little bit about some things that you shouldn't do, because the art of ops is all about what do you not do. I think is one of the most important skills. So I want to talk about that, a couple of plays that sound good but may not be the right thing, and then a few things to probably ignore. And then we'll spend the rest of this conversation really diving into kind of 3 ways that you can drive increased focus for your org and more efficiency. So plays that sound good a lot of times are variations on the other plays, but they're a little bit different. So if you think, hey, we're just going to go into this brand new untested market, there's so much TAM there, there's like all this addressable market that we could go do. Chances are good if you try to do that in this environment, you're just going to fall flat on your face. Right? And so it feels like a good opportunity. It feels like all this greenfield, but you're probably going to struggle with that. Another thing that comes up a lot of times in this environment is like, obviously your sales team is coming back and saying, man, if we just had this one feature, we could close so many more deals, right? And it's, it's your product team has to make those kinds of calls. But I think the important thing to remember is, those are not going to necessarily be a panacea either. I keep using that term, but that's kind of the situation. Is you might think if we just had this product feature, like it's our primary close loss reason, maybe it'll help, maybe it won't. It could be that people are asking for that feature because it's a proxy for something else, right? Which leads to kind of this last piece, which is something that I think happens, especially in a lot of early stage organizations, which is there's a real sense if you're still early and you're trying to figure out like exactly what your ICP should look like, that, some of these deals that are close, but not quite, you can waste a lot of quota capacity chasing those. And I think, Drew, you call it kind of force fit ICP expansion, where the organization can kind of waste a lot of time trying to fit a round peg in a square hole, or square peg in a round hole, either one, and ultimately not be successful there. And so I think beware of some of these things that look like these big greenfield opportunities. I'm not saying, to Drew's point before, like do the math, do the work on your side to understand as best you can, whether it's a risk that you should take as an organization. But some of these things that sound nice often can lead to significant pain when it comes to enablement and success.
Yeah, there was Jeffrey Moore who wrote Crossing the Chasm, had a great LinkedIn post a while back that was all about this idea of focus in a downturn, right? That companies that tend to do well in a recession are the ones that really focus on their core use case in ICP, right? So if your product marketing team is coming out and saying, hey, we're going to expand our ICP, to include all these other types of companies, and we're going to add 5 more key personas, that's probably an indication that you're going in the wrong direction. And if anything, you might want to look at the ones you drop. And one of the things that we've been experimenting with is actually requiring almost a business value assessment meeting internally for any opportunity that reaches a certain stage that's above a certain deal size, where we're actually requiring the AE and the solution consultant and anybody else who's working on that deal to come together and pitch to our theater leadership, our head of Americas or head of EMEA, and they have to basically justify and clarify who is the ICP, what are the use cases, what's the business value at stake, because we can't convince ourselves internally and agree that it aligns to what's really core to our business. we probably don't really have any business going and trying to sell that to somebody else. And I've seen a lot of people chase after use cases that really are not a good fit. And then you get to the finish line and the deal falls apart because you lost to a competitor who does that thing better, right?
So continuing that theme of focus, which you stole one of my slides from a minute from now, Drew, but on that theme of focus, like again, ops is about strategically ignoring things. And so a couple of things that I think are important here to try to avoid and to essentially not worry about, because we're going to talk the rest of this about the things you can go control. You know, a big factor in CAC payback is gross margin, and you just fundamentally don't control gross margin. And so that's outside of your purview, and you can't change, you're not really going to be able to effectively change that for the business. So you should not spend time thinking about that. Another thing you really shouldn't spend time on, even though it's frustrating because you often are on the, as an ops person, you're probably kind of in between sales and marketing a lot of times, is you're not in control of marketing spend. You can influence marketing spend potentially by doing some of the things we'll talk about in a few minutes to track the effectiveness and outcomes of that marketing spend. You can surface that to the senior leadership and your peers or anyone else who needs to see it so they can understand that, but you can't direct where that marketing spend is going to go. And then the last piece that I think is really important is, and this one might be a little bit controversial, but the first thing that I see most RevOps folks go do when they're a little bit pinched on efficiency is they go try to reduce tech stack. Like, I'm going to go reduce tech spend. But, if you look close, like at this example here, the tech spend overall, even if it feels like a lot of money, is probably immaterial, depending on your actual scale. It's the other areas where you're going to be able to make a bigger impact. So you're going to be able to make a bigger impact if you make your reps more efficient. I've seen some folks at big companies do some crazy things. Like, we're going to pull back manager licenses for like our sales engagement platform because that's going to save us $50 a user a month or whatever, right? So I think it's those places where you kind of feel like, oh, I can go in and save a few $1,000s, or there's something that that feels wasteful. But it's probably not going to move the needle. Now, that said, if you're at a company that has not had to worry about spending before and you've bought Outreach and SalesLoft and Apollo, like, yes, go cut something, right? But, just trying to save here and there on individual seats is probably not going to get you where you need to go. And in fact, you might create friction for the organization by doing so. So, which leads me into, I think the second half of what we want to talk about today, which is how you're going to move the needle for CAC payback is by making your team more effective at generating revenue. And the way you do that is through helping the go-to-market organization be focused, because focus is ultimately, per what Drew said earlier, it's how you drive efficiency. And I mentioned ops is all about ignoring things, but it's also about influencing things. There are a few things that you have direct control over, which again is why often you come back to tech stack, because you control the tech stack a lot of times and you can make some decisions about that. But what you need to do is influence what you can influence. And the biggest thing you can influence through RevOps is the amount of revenue that your reps create. And that's really where I want to spend time for the rest of this conversation. So please, drop questions as we talk about that. But there's going to be 3 areas that we're going to talk about. And the first one is really all about improving the foundation. Now, there's an element of this that's going to sound like, mom and apple pie and things like that. But I think we all have situations where we've allowed some things to get a little bit sloppy when it comes to maybe our data, or maybe being rigorous about ICP. So I think it's a really good time right now to set aside a couple of those fires that are raging and a couple of those Jira tickets that are, somebody's yelling at you about, and think about, have we nailed down our ICP as much as possible? Is that clearly articulated? Does the sales team understand it? Are they able to look in our CRM and see whether or not a particular prospect, actually maps to that, which takes us into, do you have the firmographic data that you need? Is that there? Is it clean? Do you have, if your organization is one of those that has invested in intent data, are you putting that in a place where the reps can actually use it? Have you revisited your scoring or tiering or anything that you're doing there, or your segmentation? Those are all these kind of fundamental foundational things that when you get these wrong, it creates friction and distraction for your reps. A rep looks at an account and sees that, this says they have 1,000 employees, and they go look on LinkedIn and they have 10 employees, right? Like that, those are things that are challenges for folks. The other thing I'll point out, and we'll talk about this in a couple other contexts, is this is a great time to also revisit your op hygiene. Are you holding reps accountable as they move ops through stages? Do you have clear gates around that? We'll talk about, how you can use, methodologies and things for that in a minute. But those are those things that are just so foundational to what RevOps needs to be doing for the organization that, you really should focus in on making sure that these things are right, because when they're wrong, it hurts everything else that happens, right? And so, Drew, you want to share anything about kind of the foundational aspects before we move on to some of the other pieces?
Yeah. So we had we've been using a traditional territory model at GTM Hub and now Quantive, and it was fraught with all kinds of issues. One of which was, Hayes did some analysis, and we found that we had some reps who had something like 1,600 accounts in their name. And they were just squatting on most of those. They weren't even touching barely any of them, but they knew that if they had them in their name, the leads would get routed to their BDR. And it just was a massive, inequitable distribution, I would say, of accounts. And people were just hoarding them, right? And so by not having clear guidelines, I would say, of what the reps should be focusing on, it was just chaos. And we actually found that in one region, for example, they were burning through 3 to 4 times as many accounts to get to the same results as they were in another region, right? So just massive inefficiencies. And that focus piece of it is really key, right? If you leave all your reps up to their own devices to figure out what is the right customer to call on, you might as well not even really have an ICP, because people are just going to do it based off of gut feel, right? So those are the types of challenges that we were dealing with when we started working with Hayes and team on addressing that problem with dynamic books.
And there's a question that Nate asks about the CAC calculation, how broadly to understand that, and whether or not that's the CAC calculation itself is something that should be, kind of talked about throughout the organization. I think that generally speaking, I'm on the fence about it, because it's I want everybody in an organization to be thinking like the board, like what are the big things that the organization needs to achieve. However, there are some complexities with trying to make sure that everybody understands CAC payback, because especially for that, you got to understand the business's gross margin and all of that. So it can get kind of complex. That said, everybody should have an understanding of what it means, that it is expensive to acquire a customer, and that every action that you're doing as a sales rep, you're contributing effectively to that expense. And so in a world where you're trying to drive efficiency, your job as a sales rep should be to generate pipeline or close business as efficiently as possible. So I think everybody should understand the principle of it and what it means. I don't know that it's necessary that everybody understands like all the details at like a CFO type level of everything that goes into it, but people should understand that. And they also should understand they don't need to understand all the details of the gross margin side of it, but they should understand that too, that sales reps, especially new business reps, they tend to think like, okay, I've done my job. I've closed this customer, right? But closing this customer, if they're not a fit, or if there's a bunch of lift that has to go into it, you haven't necessarily helped the organization, right? You may have hit your number, but you're creating problems down the line in terms of churn or in terms of support costs. And I think everybody should be conscious of that impact. So I want to expand a little bit on what Drew was talking about just now when it comes to territories, but ultimately, I have a link to this, but a partner from Craft Ventures, Michael Robinson, shared a really good post a while back about what to do when efficiency is your key operating principle. And one of the things that he talked about was you're going to have to understand how you're deploying your teams. Are your reps using static territories? Are you prepared to shift territories as necessary? And the way I think about it and the way I frame it is you're not in a position now where you can waste a drop of quota capacity. And what I mean by that is think about what happens a lot of times in the type of model that Drew was just talking about. If you've got a rep that has 2,000 accounts in their name and you're trying to ramp up a new rep, where do they get accounts to call, right? If you've got a territory, like a geographic territory design, and somebody has Northern California and somebody has Northern Arkansas, they both might be good reps, but I can guess which one is probably going to produce more. But the key there is that they're both wasting quota capacity. So if you have somebody in Northern California and they have a great list of accounts to go call, but they're only calling 20% of them and making their number, you're wasting those other 80% of accounts, right? And that rep in Northern Arkansas who's got, they've got a poor set of accounts to call and they're calling every single one of them and not hitting their number, you're wasting their quota capacity too. So you get a double wastage there in terms of quota capacity. So it's important to think about tackling that problem through the lens of account coverage. And so I always like to think about things in kind of frameworks. And one of the frameworks I have is a fit versus timing framework. And so the idea behind this is that every prospect that you call is going to have a certain level of ICP fit. We talked about trying to make sure you get that right. They're also going to have a certain timing. They're in market, they're out of market, right? And maybe you can get an intent provider to help you figure that out. But what you want to do is focus all of your rep capacity as much as possible in what I refer to as the good place. It's high fit, high timing accounts. If you leave your reps to their own devices, a lot of times what you'll see is reps will either maybe call into accounts that are good fits, but they're just completely not in market right now. Or worse is this yellow zone, this false hope zone, where they're going to respond to inbounds. They're going to respond to people who are coming in and they're going to try to force fit certain things. And so you're going to end up with reps who are really spending, material time in the wrong place. And Lord knows every so often somebody's going to wander off into the bad place and just kind of be prospecting the wrong folks, right? Maybe that's a new rep, something like that. So this fit versus timing gives you a framework for thinking about how do you get the right accounts in the hands of your reps. And to that end, one of the things that we do at GradientWorks, and we have a platform to support this model, but I think it's an important model because we're seeing more and more companies adopt this, even companies that don't use GradientWorks. They're moving away from this static territory model of let's carve up the world into, groups of accounts by zip code or whatever it might be once a year, and then assign a rep to a patch, to a model that's much more dynamic, that's built around the idea that reps have a certain capacity that they can work at any given point in time. If I have 2,000 accounts, I can't work 2,000 accounts at once. I can work 50 accounts at once, maybe, right? But also we understand that the accounts have a life cycle. Prospects are in market, they're out of market. And so what Dynamic Books, this model does, is allows you to allocate your quota capacity as efficiently as possible to your market. So the way it would work is When you kick this off, let's say you have 10 reps and you identify that these reps can have about 100 accounts that they can effectively work at any given point in time. Instead of allocating your whole market to those reps, allocate 1,000 accounts, 100 to each rep that are your best fit, best timing accounts. Let them work those accounts and then let them do what reps do. They're either going to learn something and disposition that account. They can't sell to them right now. They're under contract with a competitor. They're out of business, whatever it might be, or let them turn that into pipeline. And then as they work those accounts, they're going to go from 100 accounts each to 90 accounts each after they've dispositioned some stuff and closed some stuff. And so top them off, give them more accounts, and also route accounts to them, right? As they show buying signals or as they come in for and demonstrate that they, they're a hand raiser, whatever it might be. So with this type of model, what you do is you move from a static environment where you create these little pools of quota capacity everywhere that are going underutilized to creating a single pool of quota capacity that you can allocate as effectively as possible. And so I highly recommend that if you're really trying to drive maximum efficiency in a higher velocity sales model, that you look at something like this that moves you more to a model that allows you to allocate your reps and your quota capacity more on demand. And Drew can speak to this. It's something that they've been going through here and implementing in the last couple of months.
Yeah, I think from a RevOps perspective, one of the things that's most exciting about this for me is being able to achieve what I kind of think of as like market equilibrium, right? Where you think about your supply of accounts and demand from your reps in terms of quota capacity. What this allows me to do for the first time ever is really see how the demand curve and the supply curve differ or where they meet, right? And what I mean by that is I now can see by measuring our engagement on different accounts, if we have books of business assigned out to all of our reps and they're only engaging with 50% of their accounts, well, that might tell me that we're giving them too many accounts to work. They can't actually work anymore if that's seen across the board. Or if it's isolated with one rep, maybe that's a performance issue. Or if our reps are engaging all of their accounts, right, and they're not hitting their number, maybe that's an indication that they can handle more accounts, right? But before, on a traditional territory model, it's almost impossible to accurately measure this and adjust for it in real time, right? So that's one of the biggest things I'm excited about. At a rep level, we also are able to control for a lot of bad behaviors that occur. When you talk about people wandering into the bad place, one of the things that I often see is reps not knowing when to give up on an account either, right? And if they're just not getting anything back. So part of this process has really forced us to think about what the guidelines are of when do you give up on something, right? And how can you create almost a safe space for them to give up on an account and actually not get penalized by that, but actually get rewarded for it. Not you don't want people just churning through accounts. But if you give them the freedom to return an account that's clearly not good and get that spot filled up with an account that is high fit, high potential, and the right time, you're not going to have people camping on accounts that just aren't going to go anywhere.
Yeah.
Awesome. Great input. And I before we move forward, I know we're on a great track here. We had a couple of good questions come in and just kind of proposing them from the top down. Jasmine asked, she had an account recently, she got an ask recently to show churn percentage on customer accounts. Hayes or Andrew, what do you think is the best way to measure this, op level or account level?
In terms of, Jasmine, I'm not sure if you can actually add to this, but is that like a propensity to churn type metric or something of that nature? I would look at it, it's an account based situation unless you have specific product lines, right? Unless they might churn off of product A versus product B. But I would consider it the account level personally.
And then Nate jumped in here again and said, the timing and fit navigation outside of the ideal zone, the responsibility of marketing. I think this is referring to the last slide that we were on. Isn't it marketing's job to coach those leads to the top right quadrant?
Yes, it is, to a degree. So I think the mode that we're moving away from, right, is this idea of like pure stages that a prospect goes through of like they're in marketing's hands, then they're in sales hands, then they're in product's hands, right? It's a marketing, sales, product is all creating a single customer journey. And I know it's a little trite in terms of that's something that people say a lot, but the reality is that marketing and sales needs to partner on this. And so ideally marketing is prepping the leads, the inbounds, the prospects to be ready to buy. But too often what happens, and we see this all the time with cold outreach, right, is you use your SDRs to go try to just penetrate accounts that no one's ever engaged with. It's, they've seen no marketing, there's been no air cover, right? And so I view it as keeping your reps in the good place and making sure there's a good supply of accounts in the good place is a joint effort between sales and marketing.
Yeah, I was going to add to that joint effort sentiment, right? It is a partnership. I've seen it go really wrong when marketing deploys an ABM approach and sales doesn't have an account-based answer to that. And I think what really has struck me is marketing is spending all this money trying to warm up accounts and get them ready to talk to us at the right time. And that is their responsibility, right? But I think where we can play a role as RevOps is helping determine the prioritization, which accounts of those get distributed out to the reps, right? That's why when we build out our AE's books of business, we actually are doing that based off of intent and timing data that we're getting from marketing, but then we are applying our own sort of judgment on those and then tweaking those rankings and how we score those accounts on our side to determine which ones the reps actually work.
Awesome. And I know we have a couple more slides to get through. We had a last question from Adrian. I'm not sure if this is going to get addressed here in the next slide or two, but can you talk more about self-serve qualified lead and how you've approached separating the wheat from the chaff?
Yeah, that's probably a deeper conversation. That's a little bit out of scope for today. So Adrian, I would say reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to chat with you there about that and take it offline.
Awesome.
So I want to make sure we cover one main topic here before we adjourn. I'll just point to the fact that look, one of the things you want to do in this, we've talked a lot about coverage and talking to accounts, right, and prospecting. You really have to make sure that you've got your sales pipeline stages nailed, that you've got clear gates of progressions. So how deals are moving through that pipeline. So I highly recommend that if you haven't done it already, adopt some kind of a framework, some kind of a methodology. There's different ones that work in different cases. I tend to be a fan of MedPick, but it's a lot, right? But either way, you just have to have clear, measurable gates so that you can call BS on pipeline that's not real. So in the end, no stale pipeline, no fake pipeline. You've got to make sure that that's in place. The last piece I want to touch on, which I think is super important for RevOps and something you can do is, I talked about this idea of your CRO, your sales leaders are saying they're signing up the whole company for some kind of a go-to-market strategy that usually involves some kind of shift. Right. And a lot of us have our trailing indicators. We know how many deals we closed, right? We know, how much commission we paid out. We know those types of things, right? But if you're only measuring those types of outputs, even considering like new pipeline as an output of your, prospecting motion, right? If you're only measuring those outputs, those have a long lag time. So if you're trying to execute a strategy, you need leading indicators that tell you whether the team is executing the strategy that you want them to, and whether or not you see progress towards that. And I want to point out just a couple of things that you should try to make sure that you have. The very, very first part of a leading indicator is, are your reps, when they're prospecting, right? Are your reps actually putting in the effort on the accounts that you want them to focus on, right? And so this is a screenshot from GradientWorks, but you can do it however you want to here, but make sure that you understand for all the accounts that a rep is responsible for, do you have reporting about the % of those accounts that they're engaging? Do you understand the breadth and depth of their engagement? Are you just coaching to activities? Are you just saying like, hey, do 100 dials, right? Well, the question is, are you doing 100 dials on the accounts that actually matter? So find yourself, whether you're building it from Salesforce report to however you're doing it, get yourself in a place where you can look at each rep and not just inspect their pipeline, but inspect their prospecting to understand if they're actually doing the kind of outreach you want to see to the right accounts. The other thing that you want to consider is if you're signing up to go after a market segment, understand whether or not you've actually allocated that market segment in a way that you're covering it, right? Are there gaps? Like one of the most infuriating things for any kind of sales leader is to learn that a really good target account closed with a competitor and nobody ever called on that account, right? And that happens a lot of times to all of us. I mean, sometimes things slip through the cracks, which sucks, but what you want to be looking at is, do you have a way of making sure that for the segment of accounts that you're targeting, that folks are actually going out and engaging with those accounts, that you don't have some that are sitting off in some holding tank somewhere, or they're sitting off in some, SE's name that nobody's actually calling on. So make sure that you understand that so you can hold folks accountable for their engagement. And this is how you can steer the ship, right? Because you can see at the beginning that folks are doing that prospecting. And the last thing I'll point out here is just make sure that whatever CRM you use, make sure that you're tracking the key lifecycle events and sources for attribution of everything, because you're going to need early warning indicators. Inbound is drying up. Oh crap, we got to do more outbound, right? Outbound to this segment is drying up. We're not seeing deals progress to sales accepted opportunity anymore. Those are the types of diagnostics that you need to have as early in the process as possible so that you can make changes, or otherwise it's going to be some multiple of both your incubation period, how long it takes to source opportunities, and your sales cycle, how long it takes to close those opportunities before you even know whether or not your strategy is working. And by then it's too late. You've wasted a quarter, you've wasted half the year. Get these leading indicators in place. Drew, anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I think anybody who's a student of process design or lean methodologies or anything like that will tell you that one of the first things you have to do is just break any process down into more discrete, measurable parts and manage them that way, because otherwise you have no way of looking at where your bottlenecks are and figuring out what those are. And I've never regretted leaning into gathering this data up front, even if I'm not 100% sure what I'm going to do with it yet. So yeah, absolutely a fan of this.
Awesome. Well, I'll wrap up and we can share this with anybody who wants it afterwards, but a few resources to lean into. I mentioned Michael Robinson's post. Sean Fanning at OpenView has a great post. JPO actually at Stage 2, I didn't mention this one, but has a really great post about how to think about CAC. He's talking about lifetime value and CAC as a ratio, but he really gets into the details on how to look at cohorts, especially if you're in the early stage, and I think it's really valuable. If you're interested in some of the content that we talked about here, we've got on our site at Gradient Works, we've got a really good piece of content you can take a look at there. And then if you're interested in the dynamic books model, we've got that as well. So, be happy to share these resources with folks. So I believe that is it. So thank you all very much for your time. Drew, thank you for joining me on this. It's been a fun conversation.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for joining. If anybody has any further questions or wants to expand on this topic, please jump into the RevOps Co-op Slack channel group and reach out to Hayes, reach out to Andrew directly, and ask them any questions you have. This is obviously a hefty topic, and I think that we need to continue this and get some copywriting on this out to the community. I think we can expand on this further, and apparently from the feedback, I think our members really appreciate that. So again, thank you, Hayes and Andrew, for coming and doing this conversation. Looking for the next one. And again, please jump in the channel, the general channel, ask questions or reach out to them directly, add them on LinkedIn and ask whatever questions you have. But looking forward to seeing everybody on the next one, and hope everybody has a great day.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.